Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're diving into one of the core concepts of React. Components. Components are the foundation of every React application. Whether you're building a simple to-do list or a full-fledged web app, you'll be using components to structure your UI. But what exactly are components? Why do we need them? And what's the difference between functional and class components? By the end of this video, you'll know what components are and why they're important, the difference between functional and class components, how to create and use your first component, and finally a light introduction to passing data between components using props. So, let's get into it. Before we jump into code, let's take a moment to understand why components are such a big deal in React. Imagine building a large website without components. You'd have a single, massive file with thousands of lines of HTML and JavaScript. That's where components come in. Think of them as Lego blocks. You create small, reusable pieces of UI that you can assemble into a complete app. Using components has several advantages. Reusability. If you build a button or a navigation bar, you can reuse it anywhere instead of copying and pasting code. Maintainability. Components keep your code organized. If something breaks, you can fix a single component instead of searching through hundreds of lines of code. Scalability. As your app grows, breaking it into smaller components helps keep everything manageable. Separation of concerns. Each component has a specific purpose, making your code cleaner and easier to understand. Now, let's look at how we actually create components in React. In React, there are two main types of components: functional and class components. A functional component is just a JavaScript function that returns JSX. Let's create a simple functional component that displays a heading. We first create a file called greeting.tsx, and then we create our function, greeting. To keep things simple, we will just return a heading containing "Hello World." To use this component inside another file, we simply import and render it. Before doing so though, we need to export our function component that we have created in greeting.tsx. To do this, just type the keyword export in front of our function. Now let's import it in app.tsx and render it. We will clean up our code a bit here, so that we utilize our component instead of having the logic in place. Now our application will only display the greetings component, hence the "Hello World" greeting on our application. Functional components are preferred in modern React because they are simpler and more concise. Plus, with React hooks, functional components can now handle state and side effects, something that previously required class components. Before hooks were introduced, we used class components to handle state and lifecycle methods. Here's how we'd write the same component using a class. We create a file named greetingclass.tsx, and we create our class. Class components need to extend the component class from React and define the render method that eventually returns the heading with the greeting, "Hello World." We need to import both React and component class in our file. The component class expects two type arguments, one for the props and one for the state. Let's put any for both of them for now, and we will focus on them later on. This class renders exactly the same output on our application. However, you can notice that even with a minimal example, the functional component is a bit more straightforward. To use this component, we will follow the same steps as before. We need to export our class, import it in app.tsx, and render it. Class components are still valid, but functional components are now the default choice in modern React. Let's compare what we have in the two files. As you can see, in our functional component, we just have a function that returns a JSX element. Whereas in the class component, we need to extend the component class and define the render method that returns our element. Usage is the same, even with more complex components. What's different is the implementation. Now, let's see how we can make both of them a bit more dynamic. One of the biggest advantages of components is that they allow us to pass data between them using props. Let's modify our functional component to accept a name prop. As we are using TypeScript, we can define an interface for our props so that our code is easier to read through. Plus, we will get auto-completions from our IDE. Props should be defined in the argument list of our function, and then, using curly braces, we can render its contents in our JSX. Now, when we render greeting, we can pass in a name prop by defining it as an attribute on our element. Let's pass in the name, Alice. The expectation here is that our greeting component renders a generic message with a dynamic value, which in this case should be, "Hello Alice." We can, of course, use our component multiple times with different props so that we can achieve the outcome that we want. And that's the beauty of components, simple, reusable code that can fit into multiple scenarios. A key point to remember is that props are read-only, meaning that a component cannot modify the props it receives. We will talk about state in a future video, which allows components to manage their data. Let's also modify our class component to receive props as well. To do so, we need to declare a constructor on our class component that accepts props as an argument. We also need to call the super method, as our class extends the React component class. We can also define an interface for our props. However, to use this interface we will pass it as the first type argument of the component class. As mentioned earlier, usage of the class component is exactly the same as with a functional component. So we can render our greeting class in our app like this, and we should see the same output. Comparing again both functional and class components, we can see how the class component gets bigger and a bit more complex when trying to achieve the same outcome. One key difference between class and functional components is how they handle lifecycle methods. In class components, React provides methods that run at different stages of a component's life. These include mounting, when the component is created and added to the DOM. The component didMount method is used for things like fetching data from an API. Updating, when props or state change. The component didUpdate method runs every time the component updates. Unmounting, when the component is removed from the DOM. The component will unmount method is used for cleanup, like removing event listeners. Let's create those in our class component by defining the three methods we have mentioned: component didMount, component didUpdate, and component will unmount. In functional components, we don't have lifecycle methods. Instead, we use the useEffect hook to handle side effects. Here's how it replaces lifecycle methods. We create the useEffect method with empty dependencies, thus, an empty array, and define our component mounted message directly in the callback function. For the unmount lifecycle, we have to return a callback method containing the actions we need to carry out once the component is unmounted. To track updates and carry out side actions, we again use the useEffect hook, but this time we pass in the dependencies we want to track, in this case, the name prop. With useEffect, we can handle mounting, updating, and unmounting in a more concise way. To wrap up, here's what we covered. Components are the foundation of React apps and help make UIs reusable and maintainable. Functional components are simpler and preferred in modern React, while class components were used in older versions. Props allow us to pass data between components. Lifecycle methods in class components can be replaced with useEffect in functional components. In the next video, we'll dive deeper into props and learn how to pass data between components efficiently. If you found this helpful, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future React tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.